The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension as Samantha Carter, a 15-year-old with oversized glasses and a calm demeanor, stood at the defendant's table. Her voice, steady but filled with conviction, sliced through the room. "Your Honor, I object to the opposing counsel's motion as it lacks legal precedent and violates Section 1983 of Title 42, U.S. Code. Allow me to explain why." The judge, a seasoned man known for his sharp tongue and no-nonsense attitude, leaned forward, glaring at her. "Are you seriously citing federal law, young lady? This isn't a debate club. You're out of your depth." But Samantha didn't waver. With a poise that stunned the room, she pulled out a legal textbook almost as thick as her torso and pointed to a highlighted passage. "I'm citing the law, Your Honor, because it's relevant. Please consider it before dismissing me." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge, his face frozen in disbelief, flipped through his notes before giving Samantha a hard stare. "We'll take a 10-minute recess," he said, abruptly rising. But as he left, those closest to him swore they saw the faintest flicker of admiration in his eyes. The question loomed over the courtroom. How did this teenager, without a lawyer, get here, and what would she do next? 3 weeks earlier, Samantha sat at her kitchen table in her small Ohio home. Her mom's voice broke through the noise of a humming refrigerator and clattering dishes. "Sammy, this is serious. You can't just walk into court alone. We don't have the money for a lawyer. But maybe there's another way?" Samantha shook her head. "Mom, it's my case. If I don't fight this, who will?" Her family's situation wasn't unique. Her dad worked 2 jobs, and her mom picked up shifts at a diner to make ends meet. But the lawsuit from their landlord for supposedly unpaid rent was more than they could bear. Samantha had gone through the lease agreement herself, scribbling notes in the margins late into the night. She was sure they hadn't breached any terms, but hiring a lawyer was out of the question. "You're just a kid," her mom whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "How are you going to handle this?" "I've been reading," Samantha said, holding up a stack of borrowed library books on tenant rights and contract law. "I'm not going to let them take our home because we're too scared to fight." Her mom sighed but didn't argue further. Deep down, she knew Samantha had inherited her stubborn streak. The first court date came quickly. Samantha walked into the courtroom wearing a plain blouse and slacks, clutching her notes. The opposing counsel, a polished attorney with an expensive suit and a smug grin, didn't even bother hiding his amusement. "Representing yourself, are we?" he sneered. "Yes," Samantha replied, her voice firm. The judge, however, wasn't as amused. "Young lady, this is a court of law, not a place for amateurs." But as the hearing progressed, Samantha's preparedness began to show. She cited sections of the lease agreement and even brought up cases from her research. Although she stumbled over some legal terms, her arguments were clear and logical. The judge, who initially dismissed her, started paying closer attention. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked at one point. "From books," she said simply, "and from people who shared their stories online." Despite her initial success, Samantha knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The landlord's lawyer began submitting motion after motion, each more technical than the last. One morning, Samantha woke to find an eviction notice taped to her front door. The anxiety clawed at her, but she refused to let it show. She spent hours at the library, poring over case law and legal guides, trying to stay one step ahead. Her tenacity didn't go unnoticed. During one of her visits, the librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Franklin, leaned over and whispered, "You're doing something brave, dear. If you need help photocopying or printing, let me know." By the third hearing, Samantha was a force to be reckoned with. She pointed out inconsistencies in the landlord's claims and even challenged the validity of the eviction notice. But that day, something unexpected happened. The landlord's lawyer introduced a motion to dismiss her defense entirely, claiming her lack of legal representation made her arguments invalid. "That's absurd," Samantha shouted, forgetting the decorum of the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel, silencing her. Still, the fire in her eyes lingered as she stepped forward to address the court. "Your Honor, I may not be a lawyer, but I have a right to defend myself and my family. If the law isn't meant for everyone, what's the point of having it?" Her words hung in the air like a challenge. The judge stared at her for a long moment before responding. Let's see if you can back that up. The battle wasn't over, and Samantha knew it. She spent the next week preparing for what she believed would be the most important day of her life. The stakes were higher than ever, and the pressure was suffocating. But she also knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't give up without a fight. And now, standing in the courtroom, staring down a skeptical judge and a condescending lawyer, Samantha tightened her grip on her notes. This was her moment. She had no choice but to make it count. But just as Samantha finished her argument, the courtroom doors burst open, and a man rushed in, holding a stack of papers. "Your Honor," he called out, his voice urgent. "I have evidence that changes everything." All heads turned to the man who had just stormed into the courtroom. He was middle-aged, with salt and pepper hair, wearing a slightly disheveled suit. He carried himself with the urgency of someone who knew time was slipping through his fingers. The judge frowned, tapping his gavel. "Who are you? And why are you interrupting my court?" The man took a deep breath, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, my name is Jonathan Parks. I'm an attorney with Legal Aid Ohio. I was reviewing eviction cases in the system, and this one caught my attention. I couldn't sit by and let it proceed without intervening." Samantha stared at him, confused but intrigued. She had no idea who this man was, and yet he was here, on her side. She wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or wary. The opposing counsel rolled his eyes. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This case is already in progress, and the defense has made it clear that the minor is representing herself." Jonathan Parks stepped closer to the bench, holding up the papers. "I understand that, Your Honor, but I have evidence that proves the landlord falsified documents to initiate this eviction. It's relevant to the integrity of this case." The judge motioned for him to approach. "Show me." As the papers exchanged hands, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Samantha clenched her fists, feeling both hope and dread. What if this was a setup? What if the evidence wasn't as solid as it seemed? The judge scanned the documents, his expression darkening with each passing second. Finally, he looked up. "Mr. Parks, I'll allow you to submit these into evidence. But you're not taking over this case. The defendant has chosen to represent herself." Jonathan nodded, glancing at Samantha. "I understand, Your Honor. I'm only here to ensure justice is served." Samantha met his gaze and gave him a small nod. She didn't entirely trust him, but for now, it seemed he was on her side. The landlord's lawyer, now visibly agitated, stood up. "Your Honor, this is a desperate attempt to derail my client's case. The defendant's defense is weak at best, and now we're being subjected to theatrics." Samantha's heart pounded. She didn't want to lose control of the narrative. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "Your Honor, I'd like to respond." The judge raised an eyebrow but motioned for her to speak. "Go ahead, Ms. Carter. The opposing counsel keeps talking about how my defense is weak, but they haven't disproven a single argument I've made. Now, with this new evidence, it's clear they've been trying to win by intimidation, not by the truth. If they believe I'm wrong, they should address my arguments directly." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, the opposing lawyer seemed at a loss for words. The judge leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Well said, Ms. Carter. Let's proceed." The tension in the room eased slightly, but Samantha knew the battle was far from over. As the hearing continued, Jonathan Parks sat in the back, quietly observing. His presence was both comforting and unnerving. Why had he taken an interest in her case? What was his motive? That evening, Samantha returned home exhausted but determined. She spread her notes across the kitchen table, going over every detail. Her mom sat across from her, watching silently. "Do you trust him?" her mom finally asked, referring to Jonathan. "I don't know," Samantha admitted, "but he has evidence that could help us. We can't afford to ignore it." Her mom reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You've already done more than anyone expected, Sammy. No matter what happens, I'm proud of you." Samantha smiled, though the weight of the case still pressed heavily on her. She wanted to win, not just for herself, but for her family. Their home was more than just a house. It was a symbol of everything they'd worked for. The next day in court, the landlord's lawyer went on the offensive, questioning the validity of the new evidence. He argued that it was irrelevant and inadmissible. But Samantha was ready. She stood up and presented her counterarguments, referencing legal precedents she had meticulously researched. The judge listened intently, occasionally nodding. It was clear that Samantha had earned his respect, even if he hadn't said it outright. But just as things seemed to be turning in her favor, the landlord himself, a stout man with a stern expression, stood up and requested to address the court. "Your Honor, I've been patient, but this has gone on long enough. I've been more than fair to this family, and now I'm being painted as a villain. I want this case resolved today." Samantha's stomach twisted. The landlord's sudden involvement added a new layer of pressure. She could feel the courtroom's eyes on her, waiting to see how she'd respond. The judge rubbed his temples, clearly frustrated. "Mr. Bennett, I'll allow you to speak, but keep it brief." Bennett's voice was calm but firm. "This family has been behind on rent for months. I have my own bills to pay, and I can't afford to let them stay without compensation. This isn't personal, it's business." Samantha stood, her legs trembling slightly. "Your Honor, may I respond?" The judge nodded. "Go ahead." Samantha took a deep breath. "Mr. Bennett says this isn't personal, but it is for us. Losing our home isn't just a financial inconvenience. It's losing our stability, our safety. And as for the claim that we're behind on rent, the evidence I've presented shows that we've paid everything we owe. If he wants to argue otherwise, he needs to provide proof." The room fell silent. Even the landlord seemed taken aback by her composure. The judge leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Mr. Bennett, do you have proof to counter the defendant's claim?" Bennett hesitated, glancing at his lawyer. The room buzzed with anticipation, and Samantha felt her pulse quicken. Then, to everyone's shock, Bennett sighed and sat back down. "No, Your Honor, I don't." The judge banged his gavel. "In that case, we'll reconvene tomorrow to review the evidence submitted by Mr. Parks. Court is adjourned." As the courtroom emptied, Jonathan approached Samantha. "You did good today." "Thanks," she said cautiously. "But why are you helping me?" He smiled, a hint of mystery in his eyes. "Let's just say I believe in what you're fighting for." Before she could press him further, he walked away, leaving her with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. The fight was far from over, and the next day could change everything. The next morning, Samantha sat at the breakfast table, staring blankly at a piece of toast. Her mom hovered nearby, trying to keep things light, but the weight of the day ahead hung in the air like a storm cloud. "You need to eat, Sammy," her mom said softly. "You've got a long day." "I know," Samantha murmured, but her mind was elsewhere, running through every possible scenario. What if the judge didn't believe the new evidence? What if Mr. Bennett came up with something new to throw her off course? She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice her little brother, Caleb, tugging at her sleeve. "Sammy, are you going to beat the bad guys today?" His innocent question brought a small smile to her face. "I'm going to try, Caleb." He grinned, his gap-toothed smile full of confidence in her. "You're the smartest person ever. You can do it." The courtroom was already packed when Samantha and her mom arrived. Reporters with cameras were stationed outside, buzzing about the teenager taking on the system. Samantha kept her head down, ignoring the flashes of cameras and the murmurs of curious onlookers. Inside, Jonathan Parks was waiting for her. "Ready?" he asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," Samantha replied. "Did you bring everything we need?" Jonathan nodded. "It's all here. But remember, you're the one in charge. I'm just here for support." Samantha appreciated his words, but she still felt the weight of the responsibility. This was her fight, and she couldn't afford to make a single mistake. The judge entered the room, and everyone rose. He wasted no time getting to the point. "Mr. Parks, you've submitted new evidence. I've reviewed it, but I'd like you to present it formally for the record." Jonathan stepped forward, holding up the documents. "Your Honor, these records show that Mr. Bennett altered the original lease agreement after it was signed. Specifically, he changed the payment terms to make it appear as though the Carters were behind on rent when, in fact, they were not." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge banged his gavel. Order! The landlord's lawyer immediately jumped to his feet. Your Honor, this is outrageous. My client denies these accusations. Jonathan handed copies of the documents to the judge and opposing counsel. The changes are subtle but clear when you compare the original document to the altered version. Here's the original lease agreement, signed by both parties, and here's the version my client received with the rent increase. The judge examined the documents carefully, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked at Mr. Bennett. Do you have an explanation for this? Mr. Bennett shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I don't know how that happened. It must be some kind of mistake. Samantha seized the moment. Your Honor, this mistake is the reason we're in court today. My family has always paid our rent on time, but Mr. Bennett has been trying to push us out for months. He wants to increase the rent beyond what's legal, and when we refused, he started this case. The opposing lawyer sneered. That's a bold accusation for someone with no legal experience. Samantha turned to face him, her voice steady. I don't need legal experience to see the truth. The documents speak for themselves. The judge held up a hand to silence them. Enough. I'll decide what the documents say. The tension in the room was palpable as the judge reviewed the evidence. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, the judge set the papers down. It appears there is merit to the defendant's claim. The alterations to the lease agreement are significant, and they raise serious questions about the plaintiff's credibility. Mr. Bennett, do you have anything to say in your defense? Bennett's face turned red. Your Honor, I only did what I thought was fair. The rent was too low, and I needed to cover my expenses. The judge's voice was sharp. What you thought was fair does not justify falsifying legal documents. This is a serious matter, and it will be addressed appropriately. Samantha felt a surge of relief, but it was quickly tempered by the realization that the case wasn't over yet. The judge turned to her. Ms. Carter, you've presented a strong defense, but there are still details to resolve. We'll reconvene tomorrow to discuss the damages and determine a final ruling. As the courtroom emptied, Jonathan approached Samantha again. You handled that like a pro. Thanks, she said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. But I'm not celebrating yet. Jonathan nodded. Smart. It's not over until it's over. That evening, Samantha returned home to find a surprise waiting for her. A group of neighbors had gathered outside their house, holding signs that read, We stand with the Carters, and Justice for Samantha. Her mom gasped. What is all this? A woman stepped forward, smiling warmly. We've been watching what Samantha's doing, and we wanted to show our support. You're not alone in this. Samantha's throat tightened with emotion. She had been so focused on the fight that she hadn't realized how many people were rooting for her. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As the crowd cheered, Samantha felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for her family. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been taken advantage of or silenced. But the next morning, as she prepared for court, she received an unexpected phone call. It was Jonathan. Samantha, he said, his voice urgent. I just got word that the landlord's lawyer is planning something big today. Be ready for anything. Samantha's stomach dropped. What do you mean? I don't know the details yet, but whatever it is, they're going to try to discredit you. Stay calm and stick to the facts. As she hung up the phone, Samantha took a deep breath. The fight was far from over, and she had no idea what was coming next. But one thing was certain, she wasn't backing down. When she stepped into the courtroom that morning, she braced herself for the unexpected. And sure enough, the opposing lawyer stood up and announced, Your Honor, I'd like to introduce a surprise witness who can shed new light on this case. The room fell silent, and Samantha's eyes widened as the doors opened. The heavy courtroom doors creaked open, and all eyes turned to the figure stepping inside. Samantha squinted, her heart racing as she tried to recognize the person. It was an older man with a weathered face and a guarded expression. He walked with a slight limp, and his suit looked like it had seen better days. Your Honor, the opposing lawyer began, this is Mr. Gerald Hawkins. He was a former tenant of Mr. Bennett and can testify to the defendant's history of non-compliance with rental agreements. Samantha's mind raced. She had never met this man before. How could he testify against her family? The judge gestured to the witness stand. Mr. Hawkins, please take your seat. As the man settled into the chair and was sworn in, Samantha whispered to Jonathan, "Do you know anything about this?" Jonathan shook his head, his expression tense. "No, but we'll figure it out." The opposing lawyer began his questioning. "Mr. Hawkins, can you tell the court about your experience with the defendant's family?" Hawkins nodded, his voice gravelly. "I lived in the same building as the Carters a few years back. They were always late on their rent and caused problems for everyone else. Mr. Bennett had to evict them because they didn't hold up their end of the lease." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Samantha's cheeks burned, but she forced herself to stay calm. She knew she had to handle this carefully. The lawyer pressed on. "And did you personally witness any of these issues?" "Sure did," Hawkins replied. "I remember them having loud arguments at night and even damaging the property." Samantha shot to her feet. "Your Honor, I object." The judge frowned. "On what grounds, Miss Carter?" "This testimony is hearsay," Samantha said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "Mr. Hawkins hasn't provided any evidence to support his claims. He's making accusations without proof." The opposing lawyer smirked. "Your Honor, this is a witness's personal account. It's not hearsay." The judge tapped his gavel lightly. "Let's not turn this into a debate. Mr. Hawkins, do you have any documentation or other evidence to corroborate your statements?" Hawkins hesitated, his gaze flickering toward Mr. Bennett. "Well, no, but I remember it clear as day." The judge turned to the lawyer. "Do you have anything more substantial to support this witness's claims?" The lawyer shuffled his papers, clearly unprepared for the question. "Not at this time, Your Honor." Samantha seized the moment. "Your Honor, may I cross-examine the witness?" The judge nodded. "You may." Samantha stood and walked to the center of the room, her heart pounding. She locked eyes with Hawkins, determined to uncover the truth. "Mr. Hawkins," she began, her voice calm but firm, "you mentioned that you lived in the same building as my family. Can you tell me exactly when that was?" Hawkins shifted in his seat. It was a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4. Samantha nodded. "And you're sure it was my family you're talking about?" "Yeah," he said, though his confidence seemed to waver. Samantha held up a piece of paper. "For the record, my family didn't live in Mr. Bennett's building until 2 years ago. Are you sure you're not confusing us with someone else?" The courtroom erupted in murmurs again, and the judge banged his gavel. "Order." Hawkins looked visibly uncomfortable. I might have mixed up the dates, but I know what I saw." Samantha pressed on. "You also claimed we caused property damage. Did you ever file a report about that?" "No, but..." "Did you take any pictures? Write anything down? Tell anyone at the time?" "No," Hawkins admitted, his voice barely audible. Samantha turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this witness has no evidence to support his claims and has already admitted to being unsure about the timeline. I respectfully ask that his testimony be stricken from the record." The judge leaned back in his chair, considering her request. Finally, he nodded. "I agree. Mr. Hawkins's testimony will not be considered in this case." Samantha exhaled, relief washing over her as Hawkins stepped down from the stand. But her victory was short-lived. The opposing lawyer smirked as he stood. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "while the testimony may have been dismissed, it raises valid concerns about the defendant's credibility. I would like to submit a motion to re-evaluate the case based on this pattern of behavior." Samantha's jaw clenched. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her. The judge frowned, clearly irritated by the lawyer's tactics. "Miss Carter," the judge said, "do you have anything to say in response?" Samantha stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "Your Honor, the only pattern of behavior here is Mr. Bennett's attempts to avoid accountability. From altering lease agreements to bringing in witnesses with no evidence, he's trying to distract from the real issue. His own misconduct." The judge's expression softened slightly, but before he could respond, Mr. Bennett stood up abruptly. "That's enough," he shouted, his face red with anger. "I'm tired of being painted as the bad guy here. This girl thinks she can outsmart everyone, but she doesn't know what it's like to be a landlord. She doesn't know anything." The courtroom fell silent, and all eyes turned to the judge. His face was a mask of calm as he spoke. "Mr. Bennett, sit down before you say something you'll regret." Bennett glared at Samantha but obeyed, slumping into his seat. The judge turned to Samantha. "Miss Carter, you've handled yourself well today, but this case is far from over. I'll review the motions and issue a ruling tomorrow. Court is adjourned." As the gavel struck, Samantha felt a wave of exhaustion crash over her. The battle was far from over, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the opposing lawyer had more tricks up his sleeve. Outside the courtroom, Jonathan approached her. "You were brilliant in there," he said, "but they're not done fighting dirty. Be ready." Samantha nodded, her determination hardening. She wasn't just defending her family. She was proving that justice wasn't reserved for the wealthy or the powerful. But as she walked away, a chilling thought crept into her mind. What if the landlord had one last move that could ruin everything? The night before the final day of court, Samantha barely slept. Her room was dimly lit by the glow of her desk lamp as she pored over her notes one last time. She had covered every angle she could think of, but the landlord's sudden outbursts and underhanded tactics had shaken her confidence. Her mom entered quietly, a mug of tea in her hands. "You're still up?" "I can't stop thinking about tomorrow," Samantha admitted, her voice heavy with exhaustion. Her mom sat on the edge of her bed. "You've done more than anyone thought possible. No matter what happens tomorrow, you've shown incredible strength." Samantha forced a small smile, but the anxiety gnawed at her. "Thanks, Mom." The next morning, Samantha walked into the courtroom with her head held high. Jonathan was waiting for her at the bench, his expression calm but focused. "I heard through the grapevine that Mr. Bennett's team has a surprise witness ready to testify today." Samantha's stomach sank. "Another one? Do we know who it is?" Jonathan shook his head. "No idea. But remember, you've already proven you can handle whatever they throw at you." She nodded, trying to steady her nerves. As the judge entered the courtroom, everyone rose. The tension in the room was palpable as the session began. The opposing lawyer stood, his expression smug. "Your Honor, as part of my client's defense, I would like to call an expert witness to testify about the financial burdens landlords face when tenants fail to meet their obligations." Samantha's brow furrowed. This wasn't the kind of surprise witness she had expected. A man in a sharp suit entered the courtroom and took the stand. The lawyer introduced him as Dr. Gregory Hayes, an economist who specialized in landlord-tenant disputes. Dr. Hayes began his testimony, explaining the economic pressures landlords face and the potential ripple effects of unpaid rent. When tenants fail to fulfill their obligations, it puts landlords in difficult positions. They may struggle to pay mortgages, maintain properties, or even stay afloat. Samantha listened carefully, scribbling notes as he spoke. The testimony sounded polished, but something felt off. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she stood confidently and approached the stand. "Dr. Hayes," she began, "you've mentioned the challenges landlords face. Would you agree that accurate record-keeping is essential for avoiding disputes like this one?" "Absolutely," he replied. "And would you also agree that altering legal documents, such as a lease agreement, could undermine a landlord's credibility in a case like this?" Dr. Hayes hesitated. "Well, yes, but that's not the issue we're discussing here." Samantha pressed on. "Actually, it is. This entire case is built on Mr. Bennett's claim that my family failed to pay rent. But we've proven that the lease was altered, which calls into question the validity of those claims. Don't you think a landlord's credibility is crucial in determining the outcome of a case?" Dr. Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I suppose it is." Samantha turned to the judge. "Your Honor, while Dr. Hayes's testimony may provide context about the general challenges landlords face, it doesn't address the specifics of this case. I respectfully request that it be given limited weight." The judge nodded. "Noted." The opposing lawyer's smug expression faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. "Your Honor, I have one final piece of evidence to submit." He held up a manila folder. "This document outlines a pattern of late payments from the Carter family, spanning several months. It clearly demonstrates that my client's claims are valid." Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen this document before. How had they managed to pull it out at the last second? The judge gestured for the lawyer to approach. Let me see it. As the judge reviewed the papers, Samantha leaned toward Jonathan. What do we do? Jonathan whispered back. Stay calm. Let's see what the judge says. After several tense moments, the judge looked up. Ms. Carter, do you have a response to this? Samantha took a deep breath and stood. Your Honor, I haven't seen this document before. I'd like to request a brief recess to review it. The judge nodded. Granted. 15 minutes. Samantha and Jonathan retreated to a small conference room where they pored over the document. Her heart sank as she noticed the detailed timeline of supposed late payments. This doesn't make sense, she said, her voice shaking. We've always paid on time. Jonathan pointed to a section of the document. Look here. The dates don't line up with the payment receipts you brought to court last week. If this is real, it means the landlord must have two different sets of records. Samantha's eyes widened. Or he made this up. When they returned to the courtroom, Samantha was ready. She stood and addressed the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to call Mr. Bennett to the stand. The judge raised an eyebrow but granted her request. Mr. Bennett walked to the stand, his face a mix of anger and unease. Samantha began her questioning. Mr. Bennett, can you confirm that the document submitted today is an accurate record of my family's payment history? Yes, he said, his tone defensive. She nodded. And can you explain why the payment dates listed here don't match the receipts my family received when we paid our rent? Mr. Bennett hesitated, his gaze darting to his lawyer. I don't know what you're talking about. Samantha held up one of the receipts. This shows that we paid rent on March 5th, but your document claims we were late. How do you explain that discrepancy? The courtroom fell silent as Mr. Bennett stammered. It must be a clerical error. Samantha pressed on. A clerical error? Or another attempt to manipulate the facts to suit your case? The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Mr. Bennett, do you have an explanation for these discrepancies? Bennett opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say a word, his lawyer stood abruptly. Your Honor, I'd like to request a private consultation with my client. The judge's voice was stern. Denied. Mr. Bennett, answer the question. Bennett's face turned pale. I don't know. Samantha seized the moment. Your Honor, this is yet another example of Mr. Bennett's attempts to mislead the court. I respectfully request that this new evidence be excluded, as it cannot be verified. The judge nodded. I'll take it under advisement. Court is adjourned for the day. I'll issue my final ruling tomorrow. As the gavel struck, Samantha let out a shaky breath. She had survived another day, but the weight of what had just happened lingered heavily. Outside the courtroom, Jonathan gave her a small smile. You were incredible in there. One more day, and this could all be over. Samantha nodded, but her mind was already racing. She knew Mr. Bennett wasn't done playing dirty, and tomorrow could bring the biggest challenge yet. The final day of the trial had arrived. Samantha woke up early, her stomach twisting into knots as she rehearsed her arguments one last time. Her mom, trying to ease the tension, made her favorite breakfast, but Samantha could barely eat. You've got this, Sammy, her mom said, squeezing her shoulder. You've already shown them how smart and brave you are. Samantha nodded, forcing a smile. But as she got ready, she couldn't shake the feeling that something unexpected was waiting for her in the courtroom. When they arrived, the air in the courtroom was electric. Spectators, reporters, and supporters had filled the gallery. The tension was almost unbearable. Jonathan met her at the door. Morning, he said, handing her a folder. I've compiled all the evidence and notes. If anything comes up, we'll be ready. Samantha thanked him, clutching the folder like a lifeline. As the judge entered, the courtroom fell silent. The opposing lawyer wasted no time. Your Honor, before we proceed, my client would like to make a final statement. The judge nodded. Mr. Bennett, you may speak. Bennett stood, his demeanor oddly calm. Your Honor, I've thought long and hard about this case, and I've decided to withdraw my claims against the Carter family. The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Samantha's jaw dropped. Was it over just like that? The judge banged his gavel. Order. Mr. Bennett, are you saying you're dropping the case entirely? Yes, Bennett said, though his voice was laced with bitterness. "I've realized it's not worth dragging this out any longer." Samantha's relief was short-lived. Something about his sudden change of heart felt wrong, almost rehearsed. She exchanged a glance with Jonathan, who looked equally skeptical. "Your Honor," Samantha said, standing, "may I address the court?" The judge looked surprised but nodded. "Go ahead, Miss Carter." Samantha took a deep breath. "While I appreciate Mr. Bennett's decision to withdraw the case, I believe it's important to address the underlying issues that brought us here. The falsified documents, the altered lease agreement, these aren't just mistakes. They're deliberate attempts to manipulate the court and evict my family unfairly." The judge's gaze sharpened. "Do you have evidence to support this claim?" "Yes, Your Honor," Samantha said, holding up the folder. "Over the past few weeks, we've presented multiple instances where Mr. Bennett's actions were inconsistent and unethical. Dropping the case doesn't erase those actions. If we don't hold him accountable, what's to stop him from doing this to someone else?" The courtroom was silent, the weight of Samantha's words hanging in the air. The judge nodded slowly. "You make a valid point, Miss Carter. Mr. Bennett, do you have a response?" Bennett's face turned red. "Your Honor, this is absurd. I've already said I'm dropping the case. What more do they want?" The judge's tone was firm. "This court has a duty to ensure justice is served. If Ms. Carter's claims are valid, they must be addressed." At that moment, the opposing lawyer leaned over and whispered something to Bennett. He nodded reluctantly and stood again. "Your Honor," Bennett said, his voice shaking with poorly concealed anger, "if you're asking whether I altered the lease agreement, fine. I did it, but only because I was desperate. These tenants," he gestured toward Samantha and her family, "have been a thorn in my side since the day they moved in." Gasps filled the room as Bennett's admission sunk in. Samantha felt her heart race. She had fought so hard for this moment, but hearing him admit the truth out loud was still surreal. The judge banged his gavel. "Order. Mr. Bennett, do you understand the gravity of what you've just confessed?" Bennett's lawyer buried his face in his hands. "Your Honor, my client was under significant financial stress. While his actions were misguided, they were not malicious." Samantha stood again. "Your Honor, his actions weren't just misguided. They were deliberate. He tried to take advantage of us because he thought we couldn't fight back. How many other families has he done this to? How many more will he target if nothing is done?" The judge nodded, his expression grave. "You're right, Miss Carter. This behavior cannot be ignored." Turning to Bennett, the judge's tone hardened. "Mr. Bennett, this court will not tolerate fraud or deceit. I will be forwarding this case to the district attorney's office for further investigation. In addition, I will be issuing sanctions against you and your legal counsel." Bennett's face fell, and his lawyer looked ready to faint. Samantha felt a wave of relief and triumph, but it was tempered by the knowledge of how close they had come to losing everything. The judge turned back to Samantha. "Miss Carter, you've shown remarkable courage and intelligence throughout this case. It's rare to see someone your age handle themselves so well in court. Your family's case is dismissed, and you are free to return to your home." Cheers erupted from the gallery. Samantha's mom hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her face. Jonathan gave her a proud nod. As the courtroom emptied, reporters swarmed Samantha, shouting questions and praising her bravery. She answered a few, but all she really wanted was to go home and rest. Later that evening, as she sat on the couch with her family, Caleb crawled onto her lap. "You won, Sammy," he said with a grin. "We won," she corrected, smiling back. "Because we didn't give up." Her mom placed a hand on her shoulder. "You taught us all something, Sammy. You showed us that even when things seem impossible, you can fight back and win." Samantha nodded, but her mind was already racing. If this had happened to her family, how many others were out there struggling in silence? Maybe this wasn't the end of her fight. Maybe it was just the beginning. A week after the trial, Samantha was back at school, trying to settle into her routine. But things weren't quite the same. Whispers followed her in the hallways, and classmates who had barely acknowledged her before were suddenly interested in her. "Is it true you beat a landlord in court?" one boy asked during lunch. "My dad says you're a hero," a girl added. Samantha shrugged. feeling awkward under the sudden attention. I just stood up for what was right. After school, as she packed her books into her bag, she noticed a man waiting by the school gates. For a moment, her heart raced, wondering if Mr. Bennett had sent someone to intimidate her. But as she stepped closer, she realized it was Jonathan Parks. "Jonathan," she said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" He smiled. "I wanted to talk to you about something. Got a minute?" Samantha nodded and followed him to a nearby bench. He handed her a folder, similar to the one he had carried during the trial. "What's this?" she asked, opening it. "It's a list of families in the area who've faced similar issues with landlords," Jonathan explained. "Since your case, a few people have reached out to me, inspired by what you did. They're hoping you might help them." Samantha's jaw dropped. "Help them? I'm just a kid. I barely made it through my own case." Jonathan leaned forward, his expression serious. "You're more than that, Samantha. You're smart, determined, and fearless. What you did in court wasn't just impressive, it was groundbreaking. People see you as a symbol of hope. They believe in you." The weight of his words pressed down on her. She flipped through the folder, scanning stories of families being evicted, rent raised illegally, and homes falling into disrepair. Each story was heartbreakingly familiar. "I don't know," she said hesitantly. "This is a lot. I'm just one person." "You wouldn't be doing this alone," Jonathan assured her. "I'd be with you every step of the way. We could organize workshops, teach people their rights, and help them fight back." Samantha looked at him, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to say no, to go back to her quiet life. But another part of her, the part that had stood up in court and demanded justice, felt a spark of excitement. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Jonathan smiled. "That's all I asked." That evening, Samantha sat at the kitchen table, the folders spread out before her. Her mom walked in, carrying a basket of laundry. "What's all this?" her mom asked, setting the basket down. "Jonathan gave it to me," Samantha said. "It's about families who are dealing with unfair landlords." Her mom frowned. "And he wants you to help them?" Samantha nodded. "He thinks I could make a difference." Her mom sat across from her, her expression thoughtful. "You've already done so much, Sammy. If this is something you really want to do, I'll support you. But you don't have to take on the whole world." Samantha sighed. "I know, but I can't stop thinking about how close we came to losing everything. If I can stop that from happening to someone else." Her mom reached across the table and took her hand. "You're amazing, you know that?" Samantha smiled, though the doubt still lingered. The next morning, Samantha found herself back at the library, meeting with Jonathan. He had brought a stack of pamphlets on tenant rights and a laptop for drafting workshop plans. "Are you ready to do this?" he asked. Samantha hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Let's do it." The first workshop was held in the community center a week later. Samantha stood at the front of the room, nervously shuffling her notes as people filled the seats. Some were families with kids, others were elderly couples. All of them looked tired, worn down by the battles they were fighting. Jonathan gave her an encouraging nod. "You've got this." Taking a deep breath, Samantha stepped up to the podium. "Hi, everyone. My name is Samantha Carter. A few weeks ago, I represented my family in court against our landlord, and we won. I'm here today to share what I learned and to help you fight for your rights." The room erupted in applause, and Samantha felt a surge of confidence. Over the next hour, she walked the group through the basics of tenant rights, how to identify unfair practices, and where to find resources. By the end of the session, people were coming up to her, thanking her and sharing their own stories. But just as the event was winding down, a man in a dark suit approached her. He didn't look like a tenant. His polished shoes and expensive watch gave him away. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice smooth. "I'm Charles Whitman. I represent the Landlords Association of Ohio." Samantha froze, her heart pounding. "What do you want?" Whitman smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "A little chat. You've been stirring up quite the storm, and some of my clients are concerned. They feel that your actions might be misguided." "Misguided?" Samantha repeated, her voice rising. "I'm helping people who've been treated unfairly." "Perhaps," Whitman said, his tone patronizing. "But I'd advise you to tread carefully. There are powerful people who don't appreciate being challenged. Jonathan stepped in, his voice sharp. Are you threatening her? Not at all, Whitman said smoothly. Just a friendly warning. As Whitman turned and walked away, Samantha felt a mix of anger and fear. Jonathan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Don't let him scare you. That's exactly what they want. Samantha nodded, but Whitman's words lingered in her mind. She had stepped into something much bigger than she had anticipated, and the fight was only just beginning. The encounter with Charles Whitman left Samantha restless. She couldn't stop replaying his smug expression and thinly veiled threat in her mind. For the first time since her court victory, she felt unsure of her decision to continue helping others. But the thought of turning her back on families like hers made her push the fear aside. The next day, Samantha and Jonathan met at the community center to plan their next steps. Samantha spread out a map of the city, marking neighborhoods where tenants had reported issues. We should focus on the worst-hit areas first, she said. These are the neighborhoods where people are being pushed out the most. Jonathan nodded. Agreed. But we'll need more resources if we're going to help on a larger scale. Legal aid, volunteers, maybe even partnerships with tenant advocacy groups. Samantha was about to respond when her phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. Careful, little girl. You're in over your head. Her hands trembled as she showed the message to Jonathan. He frowned, his expression darkening. They're trying to intimidate you, he said. It's a scare tactic. Don't let it get to you. Samantha nodded, but the fear was hard to shake. What if they're right? What if I really am in over my head? Jonathan looked her in the eyes. You've already proven you can handle more than most adults. Don't let them win by making you doubt yourself. His words gave her some comfort, but the unease lingered. The following weekend, Samantha held her second workshop in a different neighborhood. The turnout was even larger than before, with dozens of families packing into the small community hall. As she spoke about tenant rights and how to fight unfair evictions, she noticed a man standing near the back, taking notes. He was older, with graying hair and a stern expression. Something about him made her uneasy, but she pushed the thought aside and focused on the workshop. Afterward, the man approached her. Ms. Carter, that was an impressive presentation. Thank you, Samantha said cautiously. And you are? Thomas Gentry, he said, offering his hand. I'm a property manager. I came here out of curiosity. Samantha raised an eyebrow. Curiosity? Gentry smiled, but it didn't feel genuine. It's not every day a teenager takes on landlords and wins. You're making waves, Miss Carter. But I'd be careful if I were you. People don't like troublemakers. I'm not a troublemaker, Samantha said firmly. I'm helping people. Gentry's smile faded. Just remember, there's a fine line between helping and creating chaos. Before Samantha could respond, he walked away, leaving her both angry and unnerved. Jonathan, who had been watching from across the room, hurried over. Who was that? He asked. Thomas Gentry, Samantha said. He's a property manager. He basically just called me a troublemaker. Jonathan's jaw tightened. They're trying to rattle you. They know you're making a difference, and they don't like it. Samantha clenched her fists. Well, they're going to have to deal with it, because I'm not stopping. As the weeks went on, Samantha's efforts began to gain momentum. She started receiving calls and emails from people across the state, asking for advice or sharing their own stories. Jonathan helped her set up a small website to provide resources and updates on her work. But the pushback from landlords and property managers grew stronger. One evening, Samantha and her family returned home to find a brick thrown through their living room window. Attached to it was a note that read, "Stay in your lane, kid." Her mom gasped, pulling Caleb away from the broken glass. This is too much, Samantha. It's not safe. Samantha's heart pounded, but she refused to back down. They're just trying to scare us. We can't let them win. Her mom shook her head, tears in her eyes. I'm proud of what you're doing, but I can't let you put yourself or this family in danger. Samantha didn't argue, but the incident only strengthened her resolve. The next morning, she called Jonathan. We need to be more strategic, she said. If they're trying this hard to stop us, it means we're making an impact. Jonathan agreed. Let's focus on building a network. The more people we have on our side, the harder it'll be for them to silence us. The following week, Samantha held a rally in a local park to raise awareness about tenant rights. Hundreds of people showed up, holding signs that read, "Housing is a human right," and "Justice for tenants." Samantha stood on a makeshift stage, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "We're here today because too many families have been treated unfairly," she said. "Landlords like Mr. Bennett think they can take advantage of us because they have more money and power. But we're proving that when we stand together, we're stronger than they are." The crowd erupted into cheers, and for a moment, Samantha felt invincible. But as the rally ended and people began to disperse, she noticed a black SUV parked nearby. The windows were tinted, and it didn't appear to belong to anyone at the rally. Jonathan noticed it too. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice low. As they walked toward the car, the engine started, and the SUV sped away. Samantha's pulse quickened. "They're watching us," she said. Jonathan nodded. "And we're watching them. Don't let them intimidate you." But Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing. The landlords weren't just angry, they were desperate. And desperate people could be dangerous. She had no idea what they were planning, but she knew one thing for sure. She had to be ready. 2 days after the rally, Samantha sat at her desk, combing through emails from people seeking help. Many were heartbreaking. Families on the brink of eviction, tenants living in unsafe conditions, and single parents struggling to make ends meet. She had promised herself to respond to every message, but the sheer volume was overwhelming. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her focus. It was Jonathan. "Samantha, turn on the news. Now." Heart pounding, she grabbed the remote and switched on the TV. A local news anchor was reporting live from outside a courthouse. Breaking news about Samantha Carter, the teenager who recently won a high-profile tenant rights case. A coalition of landlords has filed a civil lawsuit against her, claiming defamation and damages to their businesses. Samantha's stomach dropped. The screen shifted to footage of Charles Whitman, the lawyer who had confronted her after the workshop. "She has spread false information and incited hostility against hard-working landlords," Whitman said, his voice oozing condescension. "While her intentions may be noble, her actions have caused harm, and we're holding her accountable." The segment ended with a shot of Whitman smirking at the camera. Samantha's hands trembled as she turned off the TV. "They're suing me," she whispered, disbelief washing over her. Jonathan's voice on the phone was firm. "It's a scare tactic. They want to drag you through the mud and exhaust you. But we're not letting them win." Samantha felt a surge of anger. "They think this will shut me up, but it won't." "That's the spirit," Jonathan said. "I'm already working on a legal strategy. Meet me at the community center tomorrow, and we'll go over it." The next morning, Samantha and Jonathan sat at a small table surrounded by stacks of legal documents. Jonathan had brought in an attorney friend, Rachel Moreno, to help them strategize. "This lawsuit is a classic SLAP," Rachel explained. "Strategic lawsuit against public participation. It's designed to intimidate you and drain your resources." "Can they win?" Samantha asked. Rachel shook her head. "Unlikely. Their case is flimsy, but they're betting on the process itself being enough to scare you into backing down." Samantha clenched her fists. "Well, they're wrong." Rachel smiled. "Good. Because if we fight this, we can not only win but also turn it into an opportunity to expose their tactics." Jonathan added, "We'll need to rally public support. The more people see this for what it is, the harder it'll be for them to justify their actions." Samantha nodded. "Let's do it." That evening, Samantha made a video addressing the lawsuit. Sitting at her kitchen table with a simple backdrop, she spoke directly to the camera. "Hi, everyone. My name is Samantha Carter. You might know me as the teenager who fought to save her family's home. Now, I'm being sued by a group of landlords for standing up for what's right. They think they can silence me, but I won't let them. This isn't just about me. It's about every family who's ever been mistreated. Together, we can fight back." She uploaded the video to social media, and within hours, it went viral. Comments poured in from people offering support and sharing their own stories of injustice. The hashtag #StandWithSamantha began trending nationwide. News outlets picked up the story, and within days, Samantha found herself in the spotlight again. She appeared on morning shows and podcasts, always focusing on the bigger picture. "This isn't just my fight," she said during one interview. "It's about making sure everyone has a safe, fair place to live." But the attention wasn't all positive. Samantha's family began receiving threatening letters and prank calls. One evening, Caleb found a spray-painted message on their garage: "Drop the fight, or else." Her mom was terrified. "Sammy, this is too dangerous. Maybe we should." "No," Samantha said firmly. "That's what they want. I won't let them scare us." Her mom sighed, her eyes full of worry. "Just promise me you'll be careful." A week later, Samantha and Jonathan were at the courthouse for the first hearing in the civil case. The courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators. Charles Whitman sat at the plaintiff's table, looking smug. As the judge entered, everyone rose. The proceedings began with Whitman presenting his case, claiming Samantha's workshops and public statements had damaged his clients' reputations and cost them financially. But Rachel was ready. When it was her turn, she systematically dismantled their arguments, pointing out that Samantha's statements were based on facts and protected by free speech. Midway through the hearing, Rachel called Samantha to the stand. Samantha took a deep breath as she walked to the witness box, feeling the weight of the moment. "Miss Carter," Rachel began, "why did you start holding tenant rights workshops?" Samantha looked out at the courtroom, her voice steady. "Because I know what it feels like to be powerless. My family was almost evicted because of our landlord's lies. I don't want anyone else to go through that." Rachel nodded. "Did you ever intend to harm the landlord suing you?" "Of course not," Samantha said. "I just want people to know their rights and stand up for themselves." Rachel turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this case isn't about defamation. It's about silencing a young woman who dared to challenge the status quo." The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I'll review the arguments and issue a ruling at the next hearing." Court is adjourned. As Samantha left the courthouse, reporters swarmed her, shouting questions. Jonathan shielded her as best he could, but the attention was overwhelming. Later that night, Samantha sat on her bed, staring at the ceiling. She had won one battle, but this was an entirely new war. Could she really keep fighting? Her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a video from the rally she had organized, showing the crowd chanting, "Justice for tenants." The comments were filled with messages of support and gratitude. Samantha smiled. The fight was far from over, but she wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. The following morning, Samantha woke to a flood of messages. Her video and the hashtag Stand With Samantha had gained even more traction overnight. Celebrities, activists, and even politicians had weighed in, commending her bravery and calling out the landlord's lawsuit as a blatant abuse of power. Jonathan called her as she scrolled through the overwhelming wave of support. "Good morning, superstar," he said with a laugh. "Superstar?" Samantha replied, smirking. "More like a target." "Maybe," Jonathan said, his tone softening, "but you've got an army of people backing you now. We've turned this lawsuit into their worst nightmare." Still, Samantha couldn't shake the pressure building inside her. She had become a symbol of resistance, but she was also just a teenager trying to juggle school, family, and this enormous fight. Could she keep this momentum going? That evening, Jonathan and Rachel joined Samantha and her mom for dinner to discuss the next steps. Rachel laid out their plan for the upcoming hearing. "The judge is leaning in our favor," Rachel explained, "but we need to stay sharp. Whitman is a professional at spinning narratives, and he's likely to bring more witnesses or documents to try to discredit you." Samantha sighed, poking at her food. "It feels like no matter what I do, they'll keep coming." Rachel leaned forward. "That's because they're scared of you, Samantha. You've done what most people only dream of. You've shaken their hold on power. They're trying so hard because they know you're winning." Her mom smiled, brushing Samantha's hair out of her face. "You're already a hero to so many people, Sammy. Don't let them take that away from you." Samantha nodded, a flicker of determination reigniting in her chest. "Okay, let's keep going." The day of the second hearing arrived, and the courthouse was packed. Outside, hundreds of supporters gathered with signs, chanting Samantha's name. Inside, the tension was thick. Samantha sat at the defense table with Jonathan and Rachel, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Whitman began the proceedings with another attempt to paint Samantha as a reckless troublemaker. "Your Honor," he said, gesturing dramatically, "this case isn't about silencing anyone. It's about protecting hardworking business owners from false accusations and financial harm." Rachel stood, her voice firm. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs have yet to provide a single piece of evidence showing actual harm caused by my client. This case is a baseless attempt to stifle her advocacy." The judge turned to Whitman. "Do you have evidence to support your claims?" Whitman hesitated before presenting a stack of documents. "These are financial records showing a decrease in profits for several of my clients following Ms. Carter's workshops." Rachel examined the documents and smirked. "Your Honor, these records don't prove anything. Correlation doesn't equal causation. If the plaintiff's profits are down, perhaps it's because tenants are finally standing up for themselves." The judge nodded. "Point taken," Rachel continued, calling Samantha to the stand once more. As Samantha spoke about her work and her intentions, the room seemed to hang on her every word. "I'm not trying to hurt anyone," she said. "I'm trying to help people who've been ignored and mistreated for too long. Everyone deserves a safe place to live, and I'm not going to stop fighting for that." When Rachel finished her questioning, Whitman approached, his expression sharp. "Ms. Carter, are you aware of the financial impact your words and actions have had on my clients?" "I'm aware that they've been forced to follow the law," Samantha replied calmly. "If that impacts their profits, maybe they should rethink their business practices." The gallery murmured, impressed by her composure. Whitman's smug demeanor faltered, and he returned to his seat. As the hearing wrapped up, the judge spoke. "I've reviewed the arguments and evidence presented, and it's clear to me that this lawsuit is without merit. The plaintiffs have failed to demonstrate any actual harm caused by the defendant. Therefore, I am dismissing the case with prejudice." The courtroom erupted in applause. Samantha's family hugged her tightly, and Jonathan gave her a proud nod. Even Rachel allowed herself a small smile of victory. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was electric. Supporters cheered as Samantha stepped out, holding her mom's hand. Reporters swarmed her, asking how she felt. Samantha raised her voice over the crowd. "This isn't just my victory. It's a victory for everyone who believes in standing up for what's right. And this is only the beginning." Over the next few weeks, Samantha's story continued to inspire. Donations poured in to support her workshops, allowing her to expand her efforts. She began collaborating with tenant advocacy organizations, creating a network that stretched across the state. But not everyone was celebrating. Late one night, as Samantha worked on plans for an upcoming event, she heard a crash outside. Rushing to the window, she saw flames licking at the edge of the yard. Someone had set fire to a pile of garbage on their lawn. Her mom called the fire department while Samantha and Caleb watched from the window, fear tightening their chests. The fire was extinguished quickly, but the message was clear. The fight wasn't over. The next morning, Samantha found another note on their porch. "This is your last warning. Back off." She held the note tightly, anger surging through her. "They're not going to scare me," she said to herself. "If anything, they've just given me more reason to fight." Jonathan, Rachel, and her mom agreed that they needed to step up security and report the incident to the authorities. But Samantha knew that the landlords wouldn't stop until they believed they had silenced her completely. As she prepared for her next workshop, she vowed to keep going, no matter what they threw at her. She wasn't just fighting for her family anymore. She was fighting for every family who had ever felt powerless. And she wasn't backing down. The fire on the lawn was a turning point. Samantha knew the landlords were becoming more desperate and reckless, but instead of retreating, she decided to escalate her efforts. If they wanted her to back off, she would do the exact opposite. Samantha and Jonathan met at the community center the next day. Jonathan brought an idea that had been forming in his mind. "It's time we take this fight to the next level," he said. "We need to go public in a way they can't ignore." Samantha frowned. "More public than we already are? What do you mean?" Jonathan laid out a proposal for a statewide tenant rights rally in Columbus, the state capital. "We'll bring together tenants, activists, and anyone who's been affected by unfair housing practices. If we make enough noise, We can push for stronger tenant protection laws. Samantha's eyes widened. You think we can actually do that? With the momentum we've got? Absolutely, Jonathan said. The landlords are scared because they know change is coming. Let's show them just how big this movement is. Samantha nodded, the spark of determination in her chest reigniting. Let's do it. Over the next few weeks, Samantha and her growing team worked tirelessly to organize the rally. They reached out to advocacy groups, planned speeches, and coordinated logistics. Flyers and social media posts spread the word, and donations from supporters helped fund transportation for attendees from all over the state. As the date approached, the pressure mounted. Samantha felt the weight of the expectations on her shoulders. Every night, she lay awake, imagining what could go wrong. What if no one showed up? What if the landlords countered with their own public campaign? But on the morning of the rally, all her doubts vanished. As she and Jonathan arrived at the park in Columbus, they were greeted by a massive crowd. People of all ages and backgrounds filled the space, holding signs that read "Housing is a human right" and "Justice for tenants." Samantha's mom and Caleb were there too, standing near the front with a group of neighbors who had supported her from the beginning. Her mom gave her a proud wave as Samantha made her way to the stage. Jonathan leaned down to whisper, "This is your moment. Own it." Samantha took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. The crowd quieted as she began to speak. "My name is Samantha Carter," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her. "A few months ago, I was just a girl trying to save her family's home. Today, I'm standing here with all of you, fighting for something bigger." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Samantha felt her confidence grow. She spoke about her journey, the challenges she had faced, and the importance of standing together against injustice. "We've shown that when we stand up for ourselves, we can make a difference," she said. "But our fight isn't over. We need stronger tenant protections. We need to hold landlords accountable. And we need to show them that we won't back down." The crowd's response was thunderous. Samantha looked out at the sea of faces and realized just how far they had come. She wasn't just a teenager fighting for her family anymore. She was a leader in a movement that was changing lives. But as the rally continued, Samantha noticed a group of men standing near the edge of the park. They weren't holding signs or cheering. They were watching her. One of them was Thomas Gentry, the property manager who had warned her to tread carefully. Another was Charles Whitman. Jonathan noticed them too. "They're here to intimidate you," he said quietly. "Don't let them." Samantha nodded, forcing herself to focus on the speeches and chants around her. But the sight of the men lingered in her mind, a reminder that the fight wasn't just about laws and policies. It was personal. Later that evening, as the rally wound down, Samantha received a call from Rachel. "I just got a tip from a journalist," Rachel said. "Whitman and his group are planning to file another lawsuit, this time against the entire movement. They're claiming it's a coordinated attack on their businesses." Samantha felt a wave of frustration. "They'll stop at nothing, will they?" "No," Rachel said, "but neither will we. If they want to take this fight to court again, we'll be ready." In the days following the rally, Samantha's movement continued to grow. Videos of her speech went viral, and politicians began expressing support for tenant rights reform. But with the increased attention came increased threats. One night, as Samantha was working on a campaign update, she heard a loud crash outside. She rushed to the window and saw her family's car with shattered windows. Spray painted across the side were the words, "Enough is enough." Her mom called the police, but Samantha knew the message wasn't just vandalism. It was a warning. Jonathan arrived shortly after the police left, his expression grim. "We need to tighten security," he said. "This is escalating." Samantha's mom looked at her, tears in her eyes. "Sammy, I'm scared for you. For all of us." Samantha's heart ached, but she refused to let fear control her. "We can't stop now, Mom. If we give in, they win." Her mom hugged her tightly. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I will," Samantha said, though she knew the road ahead would only get harder. As she prepared for the next phase of the fight, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that the landlords were planning something big. But whatever it was, she was determined to face it head-on. The tension in the weeks following the vandalism was suffocating. Samantha could feel the landlord's desperation mounting, and the constant threats took a toll on her and her family. But even as fear crept in, she pressed forward, pouring all her energy into building the movement and preparing for the inevitable showdown. One day, as Samantha was working on plans for a new outreach program, Rachel called with urgent news. "They filed the lawsuit," Rachel said. "It's a class action suit on behalf of over 30 landlords, claiming your workshops and rallies have caused widespread financial harm." Samantha sank into her chair, her chest tightening. "How bad is it?" "It's bad," Rachel admitted. "They're asking for millions in damages, and they're targeting you personally as the face of the movement." Jonathan, who had been sitting nearby, overheard and grabbed the phone. "Rachel, do we have a defense?" "We do," Rachel said. "But this case is going to be brutal. They're not just trying to win. They're trying to crush her." Samantha took a deep breath. "Then we fight harder." The trial began 2 months later. The courtroom was packed with reporters, supporters, and landlords who had banded together in their attempt to silence Samantha. The landlord's attorney, Charles Whitman, opened with a scathing statement. "Your Honor, this case is about accountability. The defendant has recklessly incited hostility against my clients, causing irreparable harm to their livelihoods. This kind of behavior cannot go unchecked." Rachel countered with equal fervor. "Your Honor, this case is nothing more than an attempt to stifle free speech and protect unethical business practices. My client has done nothing but advocate for justice and educate people on their rights." Samantha sat silently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt the weight of every family depending on her, and it was almost too much to bear. But as the days went on, Rachel dismantled the landlord's arguments piece by piece. She exposed inconsistencies in their financial records, proving that their losses were unrelated to Samantha's activism. She brought in witnesses who testified to the positive impact of Samantha's work, including families who had avoided eviction because of her workshops. When it was Samantha's turn to testify, she spoke with the same courage and conviction that had carried her through her first court case. "I never set out to hurt anyone," she said. "I set out to help people like my family, people who felt powerless and voiceless. If standing up for what's right is wrong, then I'll accept whatever consequences come my way. But I won't stop fighting for justice." Her words struck a chord, and even the judge seemed moved. By the time the trial concluded, the landlord's case had begun to crumble. On the final day of the trial, the courtroom was electric with anticipation. The judge took his seat, his expression stern as he prepared to deliver the verdict. After reviewing the evidence and testimony, it is clear to this court that the plaintiffs have failed to prove their case. There is no evidence that the defendants' actions caused direct harm to their businesses. Furthermore, this lawsuit appears to be an attempt to suppress lawful advocacy and silence a movement. Samantha's heart soared as the judge continued. "This case is dismissed with prejudice, and the plaintiffs are ordered to pay the defendants' legal fees." The courtroom erupted in cheers. Samantha's mom burst into tears, hugging her tightly, while Jonathan and Rachel beamed with pride. Outside the courthouse, a massive crowd of supporters had gathered. When Samantha stepped out, they erupted into chants of "Samantha! Samantha!" Standing at the top of the courthouse steps, Samantha raised her voice above the crowd. "This isn't just my victory, it's our victory. Together, we've proven that no matter how powerful the opposition, we can fight back and win. And we're not done yet. The fight for justice continues." The crowd roared, and Samantha felt a surge of hope and determination. She had faced unimaginable challenges, but she had emerged stronger. And while the road ahead would still be difficult, she knew she wasn't walking it alone. In the months that followed, Samantha's movement grew into a national organization advocating for tenant rights. Laws were passed to protect renters from exploitation, and families across the country were empowered to stand up for themselves. Samantha became a symbol of resilience and courage, proving that even the smallest voices could make a difference. As she looked back on her journey, Samantha knew that every challenge, every sleepless night, and every moment of fear had been worth it. She had fought for justice and won.